100 Sleepy Facts About Ancient Egypt. Hello there. Welcome, friend, to a quiet journey through ancient Egypt. Over the next 100 dreamy facts, we'll gently drift down the Nile of history, exploring the pharaohs and pyramids, gods and mummies, and the everyday life of the land of the Nile. Let us begin our calm voyage into the sands of time. Unification of Egypt, c. 3100 BC. The story begins when King Narmer, Menes, united Upper and Lower Egypt into one kingdom around 3100 BC. On the famous Narmer palette, he is shown wearing the crowns of both lands, marking the first time Lord of the Two Lands became a title. This unification founded the First Dynasty and the long span of pharaonic civilization. 3 millennia of civilization. Ancient Egypt's history stretched over 3,000 years. From the early dynastic era, c. 3000 BC, through the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, and even into the later Greek-influenced Ptolemaic period, Egyptian civilization endured until Cleopatra's death in 30 BC. In total, Egypt's story spans about 3,000 years. The Age of the Pyramids. The Old Kingdom, connected 2686 to 181 BC, is often called the Age of the Pyramids. During this time, Egypt's pharaohs built the Great Pyramid tombs at Giza and elsewhere. These massive stone tombs served as eternal resting places for kings like Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid, and Khafra. In fact, by Dynasty IV, c. 2625, 2500 BC, engineers had perfected building pyramids with smooth limestone casings and precise alignments. Building with stone and mud brick. Lacking large forests, ancient Egyptians built their temples and tombs from stone, but used sun-dried mud bricks for everyday structures. Limestone and granite were quarried for pyramids, temples, and statues, while ordinary houses were made of adobe bricks dried in the hot desert sun. Over millennia, the Nile's floods washed away mud brick villages, but stone monuments on higher ground have survived to today. First stone columns. By about 2600 BC, Dynasty III, the architect Imhotep was carving stone columns to look like bundled reeds and lotus stalks. These early columns were painted and carved with hieroglyphs, and their shape mimicked the plants of the Nile marshes, papyrus and lotus. Later temples, like the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, would feature 134 massive papyrus-shaped columns, up to 24 meters tall, building in alignment. Egyptian architects were expert surveyors. They oriented pyramids, temples, and tombs to celestial events. For example, the shafts of the Great Pyramid align closely with the North Celestial Pole, and many temples were built to face sunrise or solstices. Legend says the first measurements on a new temple might even be performed by the pharaoh himself at dawn, to line up with the rising sun. Calendar and astronomy. By the Old Kingdom, c. 2700 BC, Egyptians had a solar calendar of 365 days. They divided it into 12 months of 30 days and added 5 extra epagomenal days at year's end. New Year was celebrated when the star Sirius first appeared in the morning sky, just before the annual Nile flood. During the New Kingdom, c. 1500 BC, they even measured hours of the day. using sundials and water clocks to divide daylight and night into 12 hours each. Pharaoh, king and god. The title Pharaoh, literally great house, was used from the New Kingdom onward, but by tradition we call all Egyptian kings pharaohs. They were seen not just as rulers, but as divine figures, incarnations of Horus, god of kingship. The pharaoh was the nation's supreme priest and judge, the only human who could speak directly with the gods. He, or she, as we'll see, embodied Ma'at, order, and was responsible for justice, the flooding of the Nile, and protection from enemies. Pharaoh's regalia. Pharaohs wore symbols of power. The Heka, shepherd's crook, and Nekaka, flail, represented kingship. The Uraeus cobra on his brow protected him with divine fire. On his head he might wear the Deshret, red crown of Lower Egypt, the Hedjet, white crown of Upper Egypt, or the Shent, double crown, of a united Egypt. The Narmer palette, c. 3100 BC, famously shows King Narmer with the red crown on one side and the white crown on the other, symbolizing the joining of north and south. Imhotep, architect and doctor. During the Third Dynasty, 2600 BC, the polymath Imhotep served Pharaoh Djoser. He designed the first pyramid, a six-stepped structure at Saqqara, and may have been Egypt's earliest physician. Later generations even worshipped him as a god of medicine and wisdom. By Dynasty IV, 2500 BC, the smooth-sided Pyramid of Khufu at Giza soared 481 feet high on a 13-acre base, built of 2-ton limestone blocks laid with copper tools and ingenuity. The Great Pyramid's mystery. The Great Pyramid of Khufu originally rose to about 481 feet, 146 meters, taller than any building on Earth until modern skyscrapers. Its base covered 13 acres, and its 2.3 million blocks weighed roughly 2 tons each. Herodotus claimed 100,000 men labored 20 years to build it, but modern estimates suggest a far smaller workforce. Ancient accounts and experiments suggest ramps, barges, and wooden sledges were used to move the stones, but much remains a testament to Egyptian skill. Statues and the Sphinx. Egyptian pharaohs built enormous statues. The Colossi of Memnon, two 60-foot statues of Amenhotep III, stand guard on the west bank of Thebes, modern Luxor. The Great Sphinx, a lion's body with a human head, was carved in stone as a guardian figure, probably during Khafra's reign, Dynasty IV. Its face, though eroded, likely bore the likeness of Pharaoh Khafra, and it gazes east toward the rising sun. Temples and gods. Egyptian temples were not places for congregational worship like modern churches, but homes for gods on earth. Temples, built of stone, housed cult statues of gods and pharaohs, daily rituals, and offerings. Walls and columns overflowed with carvings, hieroglyphic texts, and colorful scenes depicting the gods, the pharaoh's deeds, and symbols like the scarab, lotus, and solar disk. Many temples were astronomically aligned. For example, Abu Simbel in Nubia was oriented so twice a year, at the sun's solstice, sunlight would illuminate the back chamber statues. Thick walls, small windows. Egyptian sacred monuments have a distinctive look. Thick, sloping walls with only narrow slits or doorways. These walls, often slightly battered, tilted inward, gave stability to mud brick construction and later to stone pylons. Inside, temples were dim and cool, lit by torches or small windows high up. Ever-present hieroglyphs and painted reliefs turned these stone chambers into vibrant storybooks of mythology and ritual. Language and writing. Ancient Egypt was one of the world's first literate societies. Their writing system, hieroglyphics, used pictorial symbols to record history, spells, and daily accounts. Hieroglyphs were carved on temple walls and tombs to describe battles, offerings, and prayers. For everyday writing, they developed simpler scripts, hieratic and later demotic, on papyrus scrolls. Egyptians even made the world's first paper. Papyrus reeds, grown along the Nile, were pounded and pressed into sheets, on which scribes wrote with reed brushes. The Rosetta Stone, 196 BC. For centuries, Egyptian hieroglyphs were a mystery, until Napoleon's soldiers found the Rosetta Stone in 1799. This granodiorite slab bore the same royal decree written in 3 scripts: hieroglyphs, demotic, and Greek. Because scholars still read Greek, the Rosetta Stone became the key that unlocked hieroglyphs. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion announced its decipherment, finally allowing us to read ancient Egyptian texts for ourselves. Pharaohs and dynasties. Egypt's history is divided into dynasties, families of rulers. The Middle Kingdom, c. 2055, 1650 BC, reunified Egypt after a civil war, with pharaohs like Mentuhotep II restoring order. The New Kingdom, c. 1550-1077 BC, was Egypt's heyday of empire. Powerful pharaohs of this era included Hatshepsut, a rare female king who reigned peacefully for 21 years, Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, who briefly tried worshipping one god, the boy king Tutankhamun, famous today for his intact tomb, and Ramesses II, great builder and warrior. By Dynasty 20, weakened rule invited foreign invasion. The worship of over 2,000 gods. Egyptian religion was polytheistic. They worshipped a pantheon of thousands of deities. Major gods included Ra, the sun god who sailed the sky each day, Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection, Isis, goddess of magic and motherhood, Anubis, jackal-headed god of embalming and cemeteries, and Horus, falcon god of kingship and the sky. Each town had patron gods. The balance of Ma'at, order, was maintained by rituals performed by priests. Pharaoh himself was seen as Horus on earth, and later as son of Ra from the New Kingdom on. The afterlife belief. Egyptians believed deeply in an afterlife that mirrored earthly life. When someone died, their Kai, vital spirit, and Ba, personality, had to reunite. To make this possible, the body was preserved by mummification and buried with everything needed in the next world. Food, furniture, games, even clothing and jewelry. Aided by spells from the Book of the Dead, papyrus scrolls placed in tombs, the deceased would journey through a series of underworld tests. The climactic trial was the weighing of the heart. The soul's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, truth. A heart heavier than the feather meant a soul lost. A balanced scale meant the person could live eternally with the gods. Mummification rituals. Mummification was a sacred process overseen by the god Anubis and special priests. The brain was removed through the nose and discarded. Egyptians thought the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence. The body's organs were removed and stored in canopic jars for the afterlife. Only the heart was often left in place, since it would be weighed later. The body was cleaned with wine and resins, then wrapped in many linen strips soaked with aromatic oils. Amulets were placed between the bandages to protect the deceased. This entire process, taking up to 70 days, ensured the K could recognize its body, and the BA could return to it. Tombs of the New Kingdom. In the New Kingdom, pharaohs were buried not in pyramids, but in hidden rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings near Thebes, modern Luxor. The first ruler buried there was Thutmose III, c. 1504-1492 BC, and afterward it became the royal necropolis for 500 years. Tomb walls were richly decorated with scenes from the Egyptian creation myths, gods, and the Book of the Dead spells, all to guide and protect the king in the afterlife. Famous tombs found here include those of Tutankhamun, Seti I, and Ramses II. Tutankhamun's discovery, 1922. Pharaoh Tutankhamun, ruled 1332 or 1323 BC, died young and was mostly forgotten. But in 1922, his nearly intact tomb was found by Howard Carter. This boy king's burial chamber contained over 5,000 exquisite treasures: golden mask, chariots, jewelry. Tut's tomb is so intact because later Egyptians sealed it shut and stonecutters missed it. When Carter opened it, the world marveled at the wealth of a pharaoh's grave and was amazed by Egyptian artistry. Women in Egypt. Egyptian women enjoyed relatively high status. Noble women could be priestesses of goddesses like Hathor or Anubis, even high officials. Women had legal rights. They could own land, run businesses, and sign contracts. One of history's few female pharaohs was Hatshepsut, ruled 1479-1458 BC, who often portrayed herself in statues with pharaonic regalia. Other famous queens include Nefertari, wife of Ramses II, and Cleopatra VII at the very end of pharaonic history. Daily life along the Nile. Most Egyptians were farmers living in riverine villages. They had mud brick houses on the fertile banks of the Nile. When the annual Nile flood arrived, farmers sowed wheat and barley in the rich silt. They grew vegetables like onions, leeks, lentils, and fruits like figs, dates, and grapes. Wine, from grapes, and beer, from barley, were daily staples. Bread and beer were the common diet of both rich and poor. Bread and beer. In fact, bread and beer were the foundation of the Egyptian diet. Nearly every meal included these. Bread was typically made of barley or wheat, and beer was thick and nutritious. Papyri tell us beer was a primary source of calories, often brewed into a gruel-like drink. Soldiers and workers even received beer rations. Ancient law codes valued beer as currency. One modern experiment found Egyptian beer was very rich, even waste grains in the brew, making it a kind of nourishing porridge. Egyptian cuisine. Besides bread and beer, Egyptians ate vegetables and fruits as available. They roasted or stewed meat for special occasions: ox, goat, game birds, ducks, geese, and freshwater fish. Banquets might include roast geese or pigeon served with beans, cucumbers, and date cakes. Honey, figs, and grapes sweetened their treats. They used spices like coriander and cumin, and flavors from onions, garlic, and leeks. Modern Egyptian bread was similar to ours, thin loaves baked in clay ovens. Clothing and fashion. Egyptian clothes were simple linen garments. Men usually wore knee-length kilts, called shendit, with a belt. Women wore straight ankle-length dresses with straps or sleeves. Because of the heat, upper-class men often went bare-chested under their linen. Everyone, rich or poor, wore sandals made of papyrus or leather. Egyptian nobility loved jewelry: broad collars of gold and gemstones, bracelets, rings, and earrings. Both men and women famously applied kohl, a black eyeliner made of galena, around their eyes, partly for beauty, partly to ward off eye infections from sun glare. Beauty and grooming. Daily grooming was important. Egyptians shaved or closely cropped their heads to stay cool and avoid lice. They wore wigs, for special occasions, that could be elaborately styled. Perfumes and oils were common. Archaeologists have found cosmetic boxes with alabaster jars for scented oils: cinnamon, myrrh, frankincense. Cleansing with natron, a kind of baking soda, kept them dry in the heat. Even children's heads were shaved except for a side lock, seen as a symbol of youth. Education and scribes. Literacy was mostly limited to scribes, who learned to read and write hieroglyphs and hieratic in special schools. Writing was done with reed brushes on papyrus scrolls. Scribes kept the kingdom's records, inventorying grain, logging temple offerings, writing letters, and copying literature and religious texts. Being a scribe was a respected profession. It could lead to government jobs. But most of the population was illiterate, relying on oral tradition and monuments to preserve history. Mathematics and measurement. Egyptians used practical math. They measured land after the Nile floods with geometry. In fact, Greek tradition holds that geometry, land measurement, began in Egypt. Egyptian surveyors used knotted ropes to lay out right angles when building pyramids. They had a decimal system and could multiply and divide. They even had the concept of simple fractions. Astronomy and math also helped in engineering, from calculating the calendar year to aligning temples. Advanced medicine. Ancient Egyptians had professional physicians. Papyrus medical texts, like the Edwin Smith and Ebers papyrus, show they practiced surgery, setting broken bones, stitching wounds, dentistry, even drilling bad teeth, and gynecology. They set fractures using splints and bandages, and they performed surgeries like draining abscesses. The Edwin Smith papyrus, c. 1600 BC, a copy of older work, is a surgical manual describing injuries and treatments. The Ebers papyrus, c. 1550 BC, contains 877 remedies for ailments, mixing herbal medicines with magical incantations. Egyptian doctors knew about the pulse, heart, and even had compounds for contraception. Many early Greek doctors, including Hippocrates, acknowledged learning from Egyptian medicine. Religion in daily life. Religion was woven into every part of Egyptian life. Temples and priests managed the calendar, like telling farmers when to plant, blessed fields and boats, and performed rituals to invoke the gods' favor. Festivals for gods were common. Boats bearing statues of gods sailed the Nile. People danced and ate festive meals at temple courtyards. On everyday altars in homes, people might burn incense or set out flowers for household gods. The concept of Ma'at, cosmic balance, was core. All people, from pharaoh to peasant, were expected to live truthfully and fairly to keep the world in order. Book of the Dead. A famous example of Egyptian writing is the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells to guide the deceased through the underworld. These spells were often written on papyrus and placed in tombs from the New Kingdom onward. The most famous chapter is Spell 125, which instructs on the heart-weighing ceremony, weighing one's heart against the feather of Ma'at. Variations of these texts were customized for each person's tomb. Wealthy nobles could have long spell books illustrated with scenes of judgment and gods. Afterlife travel. Egyptians believed the soul journeyed by night across the heavens. The sun god Ra battled the snake Apep in the underworld each night, symbolizing the struggle of order over chaos. Deceased souls might be depicted traveling on the solar boat or passing through 12 gates, hours before rebirth. Illustrations on tomb walls often show the soul emerging as a small bird, the Ba, reuniting with the corpse. This poetic imagery of sunrise as rebirth shaped art and religious thought. Religious burials and offerings. In everyday tombs, not only royal ones, Egyptians placed food, drink, and small models of servants or boats to serve the deceased. Statues of family members might be left to see into the tomb through painted eyes on the walls. Prayers and offerings of food were made at the tomb chapel, so the Ka could partake of the essence. Some tombs even had false doors painted on walls. These served as symbolic portals through which the soul could come and go. Temples of the river. Because the Nile was central to life, many Egyptian temples were built right on its bank or on islands. The Temple of Philae, dedicated to Isis, stood on an island in the Nile. Abu Simbel's great twin temples, constructed by Ramses II, famously align with the sun. Even the great city temple complexes, Thebes, Luxor, Karnak, were centered along Nile canals, with processional wayways and obelisks facing the river. Monumental obelisks. Egyptians raised obelisks, tall four-sided pillars with a pyramidion on top, as solar monuments. Carved from single blocks of granite, obelisks were inscribed with hieroglyphs praising a pharaoh. They were often erected in pairs at temple entrances. Today, many Egyptian obelisks stand outside Egypt, for example in Rome and Paris. The Romans transported them as symbols of conquest. The Egyptians themselves cut them in quarries at Aswan and brought them downstream on barges. Invention of glass and cosmetics. Around 1500 BC, Egyptian craftsmen invented a glass-making technique. They made the first colored glass beads and inlays by melting crushed silica with natron and minerals. Egyptians also were famous for cosmetics. They made kohl eye makeup from galana, lead sulfide, and eye paint from green malachite. Red ochre was used as rouge or hair dye. These beautifying substances were contained in elaborate boxes with mirrors, as shown in tomb art. Master builders of stone. The image above shows the Great Pyramids of Giza at dawn, monuments to Egypt's engineering genius. Building such pyramids required advanced knowledge of geometry and organization. Workers cut limestone blocks, transported them by sledges and barges, and lifted them with earthen ramps. These techniques, honed over generations, allowed some pyramids to align almost perfectly with the cardinal directions. Even today, the Great Pyramid's base is level within a few centimeters over 13 acres. The Nile's gifts. Ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, the Black Land, after the dark, fertile silt left by the Nile's floodwaters. Every year, the Nile flooded predictably, irrigating the land for crops. They measured this cycle with the rising of Sirius and built levees to channel water. The river provided fish and papyrus reeds for baskets and paper, and was Egypt's highway for trade. Crocodiles and hippopotami lurked in the waters, but Egyptians also tamed animals for labor and companionship. Trade and foreign contacts. Egypt traded extensively. To the south, they had Nubia, rich in gold and ebony. The Sinai Desert offered copper and turquoise. Across the Levant came cedar wood, olive oil, and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, via long trade routes. Queen Hatshepsut famously sent a fleet to the land of Punt, along the Red Sea coast, to bring back frankincense, myrrh, and exotic goods. Caravan routes across the desert brought incense and spices. By the New Kingdom, Egyptian armies and traders reached into Syria and Sudan, exchanging goods and ideas. Scientific observations. Egyptian priests were also astronomers. They charted the skies to predict floods and seasons. They identified 36 deacons, star groups, whose risings marked hourly divisions at night. They recognized Sirius as the key to the solar year. Their knowledge helped Babylonians and Greeks later on. Egyptians also documented unusual celestial events. For example, they painted a comet on a tomb wall dating to 3000 BC. Metallurgy and tools. Egyptians started in the Copper Age and later used bronze, copper alloy, widely. They mined copper in the Sinai and refined gold from Nubia. Gold, seen as flesh of the gods, was used in tombs and jewelry. They hammered out tools and chisels from copper, then later bronze, which enabled their fine stone carving. Workers also used dolerite, hard black stone pounders to shape granite and basalt. Everyday life on Nile boats. The Nile was covered with small boats made of bundled papyrus or wooden planks. Farmers, fishermen, and merchants all traveled by boat. City dwellers on the riverbank often kept small boats of their own. Egyptian boats were generally simple, a curved hull with a sail. but some large ones were built to carry heavy stone blocks or serve as ceremonial barges for a god or pharaoh. Religion in art, the Eye of Horus. A common symbol was the Eye of Horus, Wedjat eye, representing health and protection. It appeared in amulets and tomb paintings. The scarab beetle, symbolizing rebirth as the sun rose each morning, was another protective motif. The lotus, emerging pristine from the murky Nile, symbolized creation and renewal. It appears in many carvings and the capitals of columns. Mayat, order and truth. The concept of Mayat, cosmic harmony, truth and justice, was central. Pharaohs and ordinary Egyptians alike strove to uphold Mayat in society, fairness, and in the universe, proper rituals. The goddess Mayat, often depicted with an ostrich feather, personified these values. In art, Mayat's feather was what the deceased's heart was weighed against in the Hall of Judgment. Inscribed on tombs and temples were declarations to bring Ma'at and repel Isfet, chaos, a guiding principle for kings, peasantry, and taxes. Most Egyptians labored as peasant farmers. When not growing crops, they could be called a pawn for state work, building pyramids or digging canals during the flood season. In return, the state collected grain, oil, and livestock as taxes. This bounty went to feed the city populations, military, and the temples. Although men did the hardest work, women could own land and even work in fields or as weavers, merchants, or midwives. Tomb curses? To protect tombs from robbers, some Egyptians inscribed ominous curses on stone walls, warnings that theft would bring divine vengeance. One famous line from a 20th dynasty tomb reads, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of this tomb." In practice, most tomb robbery was done by professional gangs or priests. Ironically, later pilgrims copied these curses onto papyrus and spread them, creating the curse legend of mummies. Mummy cult, cats, and more. The goddess Bastet, originally a lioness and later a cat, was beloved. Cats were sacred animals. Families revered their pet cats so much that they mummified them as offerings to Bastet. Archaeologists have found millions of cat mummies at Bubastis, a city of Bastet's worship, many folded in neatly wrapped bundles. Smaller, votive mummies of ibises, sacred to Thoth, and crocodiles, to Sobek, were also offered. By promising a mummified pet in the afterlife, Egyptians symbolically ensured the household could enjoy feline company even beyond death. Sheikh el-Beled. In every Egyptian tomb painting, you'll notice a humble figure named Sheikh el-Beled, chief of the village. He's the overseer of the workmen who built the tomb. The tradition of including him was to ensure the tomb's completion. Legend says he promised the tomb owner that if he worked hard and honored the gods, no demons would disturb the tomb. It's a charming touch of everyday life etched into the eternal stone of funerary art. The Nile's wildlife. The Nile teemed with life. Egyptians hunted ducks with nets and harpooned hippos, though this was risky. The hippopotamus goddess Taweret was worshipped as a protector of children. Crocodiles were both feared and revered. They built shrines to Sobek, the crocodile god, at Fayum and Kam Ambo. Fishermen used hooks, nets, and diving baskets. River birds like egrets and kingfishers appear in tomb paintings. Life in the delta was portrayed as serene and fruitful. Papyrus, paper, and literature. Beyond administrative records, Egyptians wrote literature. Tales like the Tale of Sinu or the Shipwrecked Sailor entertained audiences. The instruction of Amenemope was wisdom literature, advising moral conduct, inspiring later writings like the biblical Proverbs. Papyrus scrolls were made from the papyrus plant, peeled and pounded into sheets. Scribes kept libraries, mainly in temples, where they copied older works. These texts show Egyptians valued both practical knowledge and stories. Games and leisure. Egyptians played board games. The oldest known board game, Senyet. Passing had a set of squares and pegs. It was especially associated with the afterlife. Some boards were placed in tombs. They played with balls, thrown beanbags, wrestling, archery competitions, and used dice made from castanet-shaped blocks for gambling. Music and dance were also important. Harps, flutes, and percussion accompanied banquets and festivals. Even hieroglyphs exist for clapping hands, party time, and musicians. The Sphinx and faith. The small Sphinx statue above, in the Memphis Open Air Museum, reminds us that the Sphinx symbol, a lion with a human head, stood throughout Egypt as a protective guardian. The Great Sphinx at Giza, much larger, gazes east at the dawn. Its image, along with the double crown-wearing pharaohs, speaks of Egypt's blend of human authority and animal power. For the ancient Egyptians, sphinxes stood at temple gates to ward off evil, combining pharaonic benevolence with the might of the lion. Hieroglyphs carved in stone. The carved symbols on temple walls were not decoration only. They recorded the pharaoh's reigns, offerings, and prayers. These hieroglyphs often accompany pictures. For example, a pharaoh making offerings will have labels naming each god and item. Because of their importance in monuments, Egyptians had one of the world's longest writing traditions. Their script survived all the way into the 6th century AD at Philae Temple. The final pharaohs, Ptolemies. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Egypt. His general Ptolemy became pharaoh and founded the Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty. For nearly 300 years, 305-30 BC, Egypt was ruled by Greek-speaking pharaohs. These Ptolemies ruled from Alexandria and wore the title pharaoh as well. The famous Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, died in 30 BC. With her death and Egypt's conquest by Octavian Augustus, ancient Egyptian self-rule ended. The afterlife in art. Wall paintings from New Kingdom tombs are vivid guides to Egyptian beliefs. They show the deceased taking inventory of his goods, sailing to the field of reeds, an Egyptian heaven where life resembled rural life on the Nile, and dining with friends. Even scenes of everyday activities, baking bread, planting grain, fruit picking, appear in tombs. This was so that the person could enjoy them eternally. In many ways, a richly decorated tomb served as a portrait of one's ideal eternity. Karnak, and Luxor. Two great temple complexes dominate the site of ancient Thebes, modern Luxor. Karnak, center of the god Amun-Ra, was begun in the Middle Kingdom and expanded by successive pharaohs. It has an enormous hypostyle hall, 134 columns, and obelisks. The Luxor Temple, near the river, was mainly built by Amenhotep III and Ramses II. Every January, there was an Opet festival procession, where the statues of gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu were carried from Karnak to Luxor Temple along the Avenue of Sphinxes. Artistic style. Egyptian art is immediately recognizable. Figures are shown in composite view, heads in profile, shoulders front-on, legs profile. Important people, pharaohs, gods, are drawn larger than servants or animals. Colors were symbolic. Men often painted with reddish-brown skin, women with yellow tan. Afterlife scenes are idyllic, fields as green as the Nile's spring, even in deserts. Animal life, bulls, geese, cats, is very realistically rendered. Plants like lotus and papyrus are drawn with botanical accuracy. Luxurious piety. The pharaohs channeled immense wealth into religion. Much of Egypt's gold came from Nubia, south. Temples like those of Amun or Ra held countless riches in their treasuries: gold statues, inlaid chests, and sacred barks. Each new king proudly added to the temples of his ancestors to gain divine favor. However, temples also controlled vast lands farmed by peasants, making the priesthood powerful by the Third Intermediate Period. Education and copies. Scribes used hierarchical networks of copying to preserve texts. For example, a wisdom text like Maxims of Ptahhotep, written around 2400 BC, survives only because it was recopied by scribes in later periods. Temples often had archive rooms, where clay tablets and papyrus had to be stored. Many have been recovered by archaeology. The Egyptians wrote lists of kings, records of buildings, and even negative confessions. I have not stolen, a list of deeds one declares to clear one's soul in the afterlife. Stelae and reports. Important events were recorded on stelae, stone slabs, and temple inscriptions. One famous stele is the Victory Stele of Merneptah, c. 1208 BC, which contains the earliest known reference to Israel outside the Bible. Another is the tale of the shipwrecked sailor, a story inscribed in a royal court that became part of Egyptian literature. The hieroglyphs on these stones give us names of kings and dates that help piece together history. Calendar refinements. The Egyptian civil calendar of 365 days didn't include a leap year, so it slowly drifted. Every 1460 years, the new year would realign with Sirius again. This period is called the Sothic cycle. By the time of Julius Caesar, Egypt's calendar was 3 months ahead of the solar year. The Romans later reformed it, introducing leap years to create the Coptic calendar still used by Egyptian Christians. Religious festivals. Along the Nile, temples celebrated dozens of festivals. For example, the festival of Opet involved carrying Amun's statue from Karnak to Luxor. The beautiful feast of the valley honored the dead. People in Thebes would visit relatives' tombs, bring offerings, and celebrate all night. At Abydos, there was a festival marking Osiris's death and resurrection, symbolizing the cycle of death and fertility. The Amarna experiment. For a brief time in the 18th dynasty, Pharaoh Akhenaten changed religion. Around 1350 BC, he moved the capital to a new city, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, and promoted the worship of Aten, the sun disk, alone. Art and architecture from this period are distinctive, relaxed, curvy figures, and a more naturalistic style. It was short-lived. After Akhenaten's death, Egypt reverted to traditional polytheism and moved back to Thebes. Nomes, Egypt's provinces. Egypt was divided into nomes, administrative regions, each governed by a nomarch. There were 42 nomes, 22 in Upper Egypt, 20 in Lower. Each had its own patron god and capital city. The nomes collected taxes and organized local labor. The pharaoh centralized power by appointing loyal nobles as nomarchs, especially in the Old and Middle Kingdoms. Pharaoh's titulary. Every pharaoh had 5 royal names: a Horus name, a Nebti, 2 ladies' name, a golden Horus name, a throne name, prenomen, and a personal name, nomen. For example, Ramses II's throne name was Uzurmatre, the justice of Re is powerful, and his nomen, birth name, was Ramses Meri Amun, Ramses beloved of Amun. This grand titulary proclaimed the king's divine backing and qualities. Wealth in the desert. Sinai and eastern desert quarries provided turquoise, copper, and semi-precious stones, like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan via trade routes. The Sinai copper mines were active as early as 3000 BC. Egyptian golden sarcophagi and masks came from Nubian mines. Obelisks and statues, carved from Aswan granite, required a massive quarrying operation. Mining expeditions along the Red Sea coast brought back shells and incense. The minerals and gems adorned tombs and temples. Scribes' tools. A scribe's essentials were a palette, flat wooden board, with small dabs of black and red ink, a folded piece of papyrus or leather, and a blunt reed brush. Brushes were made from reeds with split tips. The palette of Narmer, c. 3000 BC, is called a cosmetic palette, but it is actually ceremonial, carved with the king's victory. Most scribes learned by copying textbooks over and over, filling pages with calculations or hymns to Amun. Musical instruments. Egyptian music used harps, lutes, flutes, and percussion like drums and sistrums, a kind of rattle. By 2500 BC, they had portable harps with wooden frames. Instruments were often dedicated to gods, e.g. the sistrum was sacred to Hathor and Ishtar. Temple musicians, often women, played for ceremonies. Scenes on tomb walls frequently show people clapping, dancing, and playing lyres at festivals. Metamorphosis beliefs. Magic and transformation were key ideas. Texts called metamorphoses were inscribed in tombs. They gave the deceased words to say to various gods in each stage of the underworld journey, so they could assume blessed forms or pass through guardians. For example, one spell might allow the person to take the form of a falcon to pass through a gate, or of a serpent to scare enemies. This reflects an Egyptian belief that knowing the right words could literally change your state. Military strength. Egypt's armies were well organized. Chariots, introduced from the Near East Sea 1500 BC, became key to New Kingdom warfare, serving as mobile archery platforms. Infantrymen carried spears, shields, and later swords. Siege tactics and fort building were also part of military skill. When not fighting, soldiers often built roads, granaries, and quarries. They were more engineers than raw fighters. Fortresses and trade posts. To protect trade routes and borders, Egypt built fortresses. In Nubia, temples often sat within walled towns. On Sinai and in the Levant, there were military outposts to guard mines and trade caravans. The Egyptians established Nefer, peace, and Reshephet, war, temples to deities of victory on outposts. Trade with Punt led to foundations on the Red Sea coast, enabling expeditions for incense and exotic goods, artisans and workshops. Many craftsmen lived in village districts like Deir el-Medina, home of the tomb builders at Thebes. These workers and their families made stone tomb decorations, statues, and household goods. Artisans specialized, some in carving wood, others painting or making jewelry. Their graves show a surprisingly happy life. Archaeologists found drawings of games on mud walls of their huts, and shabti, servant figurines, in their own tombs, indicating they looked forward to an afterlife much like any noble. Writing materials. Besides papyrus, Egyptians wrote on ostraca, potsherds, when paper was scarce. Love poems, school exercises, and sketches have been found inscribed on these shards. They also wrote on wooden labels, identifying tomb goods, and on even animal skin, parchment, for important scrolls. Tools included chisels for stone and carved reeds for ink on papyrus. Wood and architecture. Wood was scarce, so temples had stone columns shaped like bundled reeds. Wooden furniture, beds, chairs, boxes, was mostly for the wealthy. Farmhouses had simple reed mats. The famous bill gatherers of Ostraka diaries mention carpenters, potters, and weavers by name. Furniture often used in temples, ceremonial chairs, altars, was richly gilded, though most daily tables and beds were plain wood or reed. Sports and contests. Nobles practiced archery and chariot races for sport. Hunting hippopotami or lions in marshes was a royal pastime, often depicted on temple walls as proof of valor. Wrestling and javelin throwing were also common. The athletic training of princes was part of royal education. Sports were linked to religion, too. Hymns called on gods like Neith, archery goddess, to bless the hunt. Language evolution. The Egyptian language had several phases. Old Egyptian, used in pyramid texts. Middle Egyptian, Classical Egyptian in many hieroglyphic inscriptions. Late Egyptian, Demotic, a cursive script. And finally Coptic, written with Greek letters in Christian times. Coptic is still used as the liturgical language of the Coptic Church. Though unrelated to modern Arabic, it preserves the ancient tongue through Christian hymn books, libraries, and knowledge. The temples of Alexandria in the Ptolemaic period formed what may have been the ancient world's greatest library and center of scholarship. Egyptian knowledge, medicine, astronomy, etc., merged with Greek science there. Works of Euclid and Archimedes were translated into Arabic later, preserving Hellenistic science. Meanwhile, in Egypt itself, temple libraries continued through Roman times on traditional scrolls and papyri. Roman and Byzantine Egypt. When Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BC, they made Alexandria its breadbasket. Emperors declared themselves pharaohs too, and kept temples open. Over centuries, Latin became the language of administration. In the 4th century AD, Christianity spread. Many temples were closed or converted. Their priesthoods declined. However, some pagan practices lingered until the 6th century. Byzantine, Eastern Roman rule, ended when Muslim Arabs conquered Egypt in 642 AD, but that is beyond our ancient scope. The Transport Revolution. The ancient Egyptians built one of the first extensive road networks, mostly packed earth, linking quarries and borders to the Nile. Yet most long-distance travel used Nile boats, even papyrus rafts. Temples depict fleets of river barges loaded with obelisks or statues being floated to work sites. In the deserts, they used donkeys and camels, introduced later in Egyptian history, for caravans. The Nile's annual flood was like a superhighway each summer for bringing goods north. Administrative innovation. To govern their large kingdom, Egyptians invented a detailed bureaucracy. Officials kept ledgers of grain, livestock, and labor. The vizier, second only to the king, oversaw justice, treasury, and all administration. Civil service exams did not exist, but positions often passed within families. Hierarchical titles, overseers of fields, treasurers, etc., appear in tomb inscriptions. By the New Kingdom, even provinces had governors under the pharaoh's authority. Ramses II, a model king. Ramesses II, ruled 1279 to 1213 BC, is one of Egypt's most famous pharaohs. He expanded temples and built the new capital, Pi-Ramesses, in the Nile Delta. Known as Ramses the Great, he fought the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites and later signed history's earliest known peace treaty. Many statues of him still stand. He reigned so long, 66 years, that he outlasted many of his sons and was often called Ozymandias in later literature. Astronomical ceiling. Some tombs feature the sky, painted deep blue with stars, planets, and constellations. Senenmut's tomb, advisor to Queen Hatshepsut, famously has a ceiling map of deacons and planets. These star maps helped priests keep calendar time. Astronomy was intertwined with religion. The star Sirius's annual return was not only New Year, but also the rebirth of the goddess Sopdet, Sirius. She was seen as companion to Osiris's resurrection. Essentials of daily life. A typical Egyptian day began at dawn. Farmers rose with the sun to tend their fields. Craftsmen headed to workshops in the village or temple courtyards. At noon, people rested, keeping cool in shaded courtyards. The Nile provided cool baths. Men and women often bathed together in the river in privacy. Evening meals might be enjoyed on roof terraces. candles and oil lamps lit homes at night. Cosmic kingship. Egyptian kings associated themselves with cosmic cycles. Many pharaohs took coronation names like User-Mat-Re, Ra is powerful through truth, or Men-Keper-Re, lasting is the manifestation of Ra, to connect themselves with the sun god Ra. The burial of pharaohs at Memphis, associated with Ptah, or Thebes, Amun, reinforced their divine roles. Even dynasties tried to ensure dynastic names linked to deities, e.g., all Ptolemies took the name Philopator, meaning beloved of his father, Amun-Ra. Egyptian war chariots. The Egyptians adopted horse-drawn chariots from the Asian steppes around 1600 BC. Each chariot had 2 warriors, a driver and an archer. Chariots were used for flanking in battle and for hunting in open country. King Tut's tomb famously contained 3 chariots. The use of these vehicles was crucial in the 15th–13th centuries BC, when Egypt campaigned in Syria and Palestine. Feasts and banquets. Nobles held lavish feasts with tables heaped high, ducks, geese, stuffed pigeons, fresh bread, and baskets of fruit, dates, melons, pomegranates. Guests reclined on low couches and ate with their fingers or spoons. Wine, red and white from Egyptian grapes or imported, was served in pottery goblets. Music and clapping accompanied entertainment. Groves of date palms and vineyards were prized by the elite for making these foods and drinks. Games for the afterlife. The board game Senet was thought to have a magical aspect. It is depicted in tombs as one way for the deceased to enjoy themselves or to aid in the journey after death. Another game was Mayhan, circa 3000 BC, a coiled serpent board. People carried small Senet boards in miniature form as protective amulets. Playing games was both pastime and ritual. It connected daily life to spiritual beliefs, sharpened awareness of astronomy. Besides calendar stars, Egyptians observed the planets. The rising of the planet Venus at dawn, as the morning star, was linked to Isis, and its setting in the west, as evening star, to Osiris. Temples were sometimes aligned to birth or death of stars or planets. Such careful sky watching was part of temple priest duties, blending science with worship. Egyptian numerals. They had a numeral system based on powers of 10. Special symbols stood for 1, 10, 100, 1000, etc. For example, one stroke is 1, a heel bone symbol is 10, a coil of rope is 100. Numbers were written by repeating these symbols, for example, 3 coils for 300. Using this system, they could do most calculations needed for building and astronomy, though long divisions were done by educated guesswork. Egyptian fencing. Unlike Greek city-states, Egypt had no fencing schools, but they did use fences. Shield and spear or small axes were common in early warfare. By the New Kingdom, armies used iron, from meteorites or trade, for swords, kopesh, a sickle-shaped sword. Royal tomb paintings often show pharaohs with gold-knobbed maces, symbolizing their right to rule by force when needed. Marketplace chatter. Archaeologists have found evidence of shops and vendors. Marketplaces in cities sold onions, garlic, fish, goat meat, dates, and linen cloth. Label fragments and receipts on ostraca tell us shopkeepers gave credit and people bargained. Some tomb scenes depict market stands. There were also traveling peddlers who sold pottery, reed mats, or cosmetics. Prices were usually set in baskets of grain or jars of beer as medium of exchange. Egyptian boats on the move. A common river transport was the papyrus reed boat. Imagine a big bundle of tied reeds pointed at each end. These were simple but effective for fishing and short trips. Larger wooden boats had sails. When wind was favorable, they saved rowing time. Oars were used upstream. The famous Khufu ship, discovered disassembled in the Great Pyramid, was a 43-meter cedar vessel built for his funerary rites, showing their advanced shipbuilding. Commemorating victory. Pharaohs recorded victories in battle on temple walls and obelisks. For example, inscriptions at Karnak boast of Thutmose III's conquest of 340 cities in 16 campaigns. Victory stelae, stone monuments, were set up where triumphs occurred. Ramses II set an image of himself smiting enemies at Abu Simbel. Such propaganda ensured the pharaoh's power was remembered and encouraged loyalty among the people. Protective amulets. Ordinary Egyptians wore amulets for protection. Eye of Horus for health, jed pillars for stability, scarabs for rebirth, and hieroglyphic spells written on small plaques. Dead people were often buried with dozens of amulets placed within their wrappings. Magic words were inscribed around doorways. This widespread belief in amulets shows how magic and faith were part of daily life. Egypt's longevity versus Cleopatra. A fun fact: Cleopatra VII ruled 2,000 years after the Great Pyramid was built. That is, the last pharaoh lived closer in time to Shakespeare than to the builders of Giza. It highlights how vast Egypt's history was and how connected ancient and modern times are when measured by human lifespans. Egyptian children. Babies and children wore little clothes or wigs. Kids played with wooden animals, dolls, and ball games. Family tomb inscriptions sometimes show children of the deceased enjoying youthful activities. Parents taught their sons reading and arithmetic. Girls learned weaving and household skills. Pets, dogs, monkeys, birds, were part of family life. Pet. Burials have been found. Egyptian art inspires us. The beauty of Egypt lives on. The aesthetic of their art and architecture influenced the Greeks and Romans, and later was rediscovered during the Renaissance and beyond. When Napoleon invaded in 1798, his scholars, savants, recorded many Egyptian monuments, sparking Egyptomania in Europe. Structures like obelisks now in London and New York, Cleopatra's Needles, are direct links. Even today, designs like scarab-shaped jewelry and lotus columns echo 5,000-year-old ideas. Legacy and awe. Finally, we leave Egypt marveling at what those ancient people achieved. The relative peace of the Pax Egyptica, centuries of stability during the New Kingdom, owed much to those farms, soldiers, and scribes. With sword and plow, bricks and bronze, the Egyptians created the monuments that still astonish us. Their temples let us step back into a world of pharaohs and gods. And if you ever find yourself on the Nile at night, remember, the same constellations shine above where once Akhenaten prayed to Aten, and ordinary people gazed in wonder at the sky, dreaming of eternity.